8:35 a.m. Tuesday. An hour and a half after the water first began spilling over the levee near Main and Monument, the water in most of the downtown streets was just over 3 feet most at the shallowest points. But the fantastic current had slowed considerably, and it seemed that the water might have reached its peak. It was just about then that the inconceivable happened. A great section of the levee, 350 feet long and 26 feet deep, at the head of Taylor Street, east of the downtown district, suddenly gave way, and a fantastic volume of water thundered into the streets. It spread in all directions in a high, vicious wave of foaming yellow, varying from 5 to 8 feet in depth as it smashed around corners, boomed down streets, tossed and buckled and broke autos and buggies and trolleys and sheds as if they were tiny toys. Wherever the intersecting currents collided at street corners, great splashing waves spurted high into the air and fell back upon themselves with the crash of a Niagara. The impact of these waves slashing through the city was incredible to witness. Trees and poles crashed down, houses jarred off their foundations, and drifted into the streets to smash into one another and break apart in splintered sections. Everything movable was swept along in that irresistible current. Dozens, scores, then hundreds of horses swam freely, screaming in terror, trying desperately to climb onto anything above water and mostly failing, being tossed into the sides of buildings or rammed against poles or sucked down in the great whirlpools that formed at every corner. Streetcars were picked up, turned over, and tossed like toys through show windows and the sides of residences. One of them came to rest upside down in front of the YMCA, another in a cellar. Immense stones were carried great distances, rolling along under the surface like gigantic bowling balls, and as destructive as cannonballs. The asphalt pavements of many streets split and then began rolling up like huge bales of carpeting until they became so large that not even this great water pressure could move them farther. A tremendous bridge girder, 12 inches square and 75 feet long, weighing over half a ton, shot along on the surface and then arrowed completely through one residence on Monument Avenue, as if the house had been made of cheese, and then lodged halfway through a second. The continuous sound of smashing glass as storefronts and residence windows shattered was particularly unnerving, and during those first few hours the streets were filled with everything imaginable that could float: grand pianos and chairs, sofas and beds, outhouses and oil tanks, wagons and timbers, and poles and houses and bodies. 8:45 a.m. Tuesday. Teresa Walter was just passing the foot of the basement steps in the public library when she heard Mary Altoff's cry for them to leave. Out of sight of the others, she didn't hesitate, but ran up the steps and out the side door. The water in Cooper Park was up to her knees, but she surged through it desperately toward the southeast. The canal bridge at 3rd Street was still clear of water. Although the street on both sides was covered, she ran across the bridge and noted gratefully that the water over here was only ankle deep. Stopping to get her breath for a moment, she leaned against a lamppost, gasping. There was a sharp pain in her side, but she noted it only fleetingly. The gurgling of the waters about her was constant, but a louder, roaring splash caused her to jerk around, and she cried, "Oh!" The great curling yellow water came gushing out of Idlewood Avenue to the north, and met another of the same size bursting from East Monument Avenue. Still another, only slightly smaller, thundered across the canal from East Second Street, only a block north of her. The individual waves met at the northeast corner of Cooper Park and merged to form a long wall of water fully 6 feet high. Even as she watched, frozen with fear, Teresa saw four waiting men swept off their feet to disappear in the boiling van of the foamy water. Two horses and their riders went down as well, and even over the savage rumble of the water, she heard the piercing scream of one of the animals. It served to break the spell that rooted her, and she turned and ran east on 3rd Street. She had run only a dozen steps or so when ahead of her, pouring into 3rd Street from the intersecting streets of Madison, Sears, and Webster from the north, similar and only slightly smaller waves tumbled forth and turned westward toward her. She changed direction herself, running as fast as she could to the southeast on Wayne Avenue. Behind her, she heard the wave reach the corner and looked back, fearing all was lost. But the waves continued their rush to the west on 3rd. Some of the water spread down Wayne Avenue, but almost immediately it began to slow because the ground was a little higher here and the path of least resistance was to the west. She slowed her run, but still kept moving southeast to the intersection of 5th Street. She became aware now that people were calling her from windows, imploring her to go inside somewhere to safety, but she paid them no heed. Home was safety, and there was where she was going. There the ground was high, and there she would be safe at last. A man darted from a doorway of the old brick residence on the corner and ran down the steps into the water. He was a heavy, red faced man with a handlebar mustache, and this little exertion had already set him to panting. "Come," he said urgently, taking her arm. "I take you to upstairs where is safe from water." "No," she jerked her arm from his grasp, and the man nearly fell. "No," she repeated, starting to run again. "I'm going home." The man took a few half-hearted steps to follow her east on 5th Street, then stopped disgustedly and sloshed back to the house. On the porch he stopped and looked after her. "Why you run away?" he shouted. "You get drowned for sure, you stupid woman." Teresa Walter paid no attention to him. From the first three intersections ahead of her, Walnut, Bainbridge, and McDonough Streets, a small amount of water was running onto 5th from the north. It flooded the street quickly, but only to a depth of a few inches. Beyond those streets, 5th Street climbed to a higher ground, and far ahead she could see people on the hill watching what was happening below them. She sloshed along and became aware that other people were now leaving their homes and shops behind her and following her lead toward the higher ground. Her throat felt raw, and her heart hammered so rapidly in her chest that it frightened her. But she didn't stop again until she was clear of the water. A small crowd gathered around her, asking anxious questions. It was hard to speak, and she told them haltingly of what she had witnessed. But the effort was too much, and she shook her head and pushed her way through them. 30 minutes after leaving the library, Teresa Walter opened the door of her own house, 18 blocks away at 128 South McClure Street. She felt weak and sick And although she had picked the last 8 blocks, or she had walked the last 8 blocks at a much reduced pace, her heart continued to pound dreadfully. She dropped to the couch and lay there for a long while, regaining her breath and giving her heart a chance to slow down. At last she sat up and clasped her hands together and looked unseeingly at the ceiling. Oh, God, she prayed, please save Dayton. Please, God.